Good afternoon. I'm Bill Rasmussen, Senior Museum Collections Curator at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I welcome you to this month's Curators at Work program. This is a regular series where our curators share stories about working with our museum collections. And it's a part of a vast library of online programs that we offer as part of our Virginia History at Home initiative. And if you haven't already seen what we have to offer, you can go on the internet to virginiahistory.org/at-home to see a selection that we offer of free digital resources, including podcasts, webinars, virtual tours, and hours of recorded lectures. I mean, like 2 decades or more of lectures in our lecture hall. So it's quite a library there. Before I get started, I want to thank our members because none of what we do, we could do without their support. We do not receive any state operating support, and it's through public donations that we are able to preserve and share Virginia's story and offer programs like this. Now, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments bar, or at the end, we'll do our best to answer them as part of today's program. So I am joined by my colleague and producer, Haley Fenner, who is making all this happen and will advance these images as I go along. Well, you see, our title is So Beautiful an Arch, the history of Virginia's natural bridge. So Beautiful an Arch is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and he's a key figure in all of this. And I'm talking about the history of the natural bridge. And the reason for this, and this talk is an expansion of an article that I wrote in our Virginia Museum of History and Culture quarterly magazine, but I'm going into a lot more depth here and showing you a lot more images. And the reason for doing all this is that our next door neighbor at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts has an extraordinary show about the images, the art of the natural bridge. So my neighbor and colleague Chris Oliver has brought together some 70 images of natural bridge. Nobody's ever done anything approaching that in quantity. And the show is up through August, and we invite you to go to it while it's still there, because you may have to wait another 20 years or so before anything like this happens again. So Haley, if we look at the first image, and this is a painting that's in the show at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, it's Thomas Jefferson at Natural Bridge. It's a huge painting that I've never seen it before. It's housed at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. A relatively minor artist named Caleb Boyle, done about 1801, and it's almost like life size. It's 7.5 feet tall, and there it shows Jefferson with his natural bridge because he purchased it. He purchased it in 1774. He purchased it from the King of England so that it would be preserved. And it was in Jefferson. It's interesting. All these people of the Enlightenment, they're doing so many things. That's the same year that he wrote his Summary View of the Rights of British America, which is the booklet that he offered to the Virginia legislature that complained about what colonists have been saying all along since 1765, that Parliament has no right to tax the colonies. That's the same year that he purchased his natural bridge, and that Summary View of the Rights of British Americans would earn Jefferson the job 12 years later to write the Declaration of Independence. So it's fascinating the way these events overlap. So Jefferson does this right at the right time. He talks about the sublimity of natural bridge. And the timing's perfect because right at this point, there's a revolutionary change taking place in man's approach to the arts. And it affected how people through the 19th century would view nature. And it explains this intriguing history of why in the 1800s, all the way up to the Civil War and a little bit after, natural bridge was considered one of the most exciting and most fascinating things, landscapes in the whole country. And then today, it's not nearly so interesting. And it has to do with this concept of the sublime. So I want to talk about that. And that explains this intriguing history of how Natural Bridge has been viewed and how it became an icon of American culture, and why it was appreciated so much in the 19th century. So, Haley, if we go to the next image, I was going to mention that's what it really looks like. Caleb Boyle didn't do too good a job on getting the thickness of the bridge at the top. But a lot of people that depicted it, they'd never been there, obviously, but that didn't really seem to matter. It had just become an icon and a symbol. So the next image I want to talk about is why we're talking about Jefferson, to talk about the classical approach to arts and to art, all the arts. And since from the Renaissance, for the past 300 years up to the time of Jefferson, the philosophy that Renaissance artists and architects had developed was guided aesthetic thought. It was the idea that originated with the ancient Greeks and Romans, and they believed that beauty could be defined in terms of quality that are inherent in the object. And in terms of architecture, we know exactly what they were saying, because one of the Roman architects, Vitruvius, wrote a book and it survived. And in it, he said that there are fixed rules for architecture, and a building has to be symmetrical, it has to be proportioned, and there has to be a relationship of the parts to the whole. And that's certainly true in Jefferson's Capitol building here in Richmond. And that's why that building's still there, and buildings around it get torn down, it seems like every 20 or 30 years. Like people talking about the city hall, the building across Broad Street, the modern building, and how that one needs to go down. It doesn't follow these rules. It doesn't follow the proportion and the relationship of the parts to whole. That sort of thing. So if we look at this classical philosophy of bringing order to the natural world, if we look at the next image, we see it in landscape. This is part of Versailles. Louis XIV gathered 36,000 people to control nature, to bring order to nature. So it's symmetrical, it's carefully proportioned. There's a relationship of the parts to the whole. It doesn't deal much with reality. And if we look at the next image, I'll show you a painting, what painters were doing. This is Claude Lorraine. He did innumerable views like this in the same decade as most of Versailles, 1660s. And if you look at this, and there's a good example of just like this at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the Claude Lorraine painting, where you start off on the left, you make your way over to the right, and then that big clump of trees pulls you over there, and then you move to the left to that next clump of trees, then you move into the water and the bridge and into the distance. And it's a very structured and ordered world. Well, by the time of Jefferson, people were getting tired of this classical approach that attempted to bring order and symmetry to the landscape. It just no longer seemed adequate. It seemed restrictive. It seemed incomplete. And so new ideas of thought opened, and artists they turned the tables, and they were interested now in the emotional response that a landscape or building could give to you. And they're dealing with the fact that there are natural forces that man cannot control. They're beyond the classical order, the classical canon of order. Just didn't deal with this. So what develops is a movement in all the arts. We usually call the Romantic movement. And it appeals to the emotion. Romantic means appeal to the emotions. And you see it in everything from the music of Ludwig Beethoven to the poetry of Lord Byron. And this idea deals with the concepts of the sublime and the beautiful. And so if we look at the next image, a number of people wrote books about them, but this man wrote the most influential of them. It's Edmund Burke, and his book is a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, first published in 1757, then republished routinely for decades. Now, students of English history and American history know this man. This Edmund Burke was one of the people who stood up in Parliament and defended the rights of the American colonies. But that didn't limit him from delving into all sorts of things. He's like Jefferson in that sense. These people of the Enlightenment, they didn't limit themselves into their interests. So I will read some quotes from his book. It's interesting. He's trying to explain how emotionally we relate to things that are beautiful and to things that are sublime. So, the word sublime today doesn't have much meaning. It would not at all like it had then. I mean, we might say that the taste of that ice cream was sublime, which is rather trite and trivial. These people were talking about serious forces of nature that made us sort of shake in our boots and realize that we don't really control much at all. So, we'll talk a little bit about beauty. Burke said that the classicist rules about beauty, that symmetry, proportion, harmony. He found that beauty is more in things that are small, smooth, varied in form, delicate, fragile, clear, and brightly colored. That he said, quote, induce in us a sense of affection and tenderness. So a rose is certainly beautiful, and he says. He questions whether beauty is related at all to proportion, because he says a swan, the next image, is certainly beautiful, but he has it's disproportion in his neck and tail, but he's extraordinarily beautiful. And if you look at the next image of rose as well, when you look at the rose back on the rose bush, that's really the proportion and balance is sort of thrown off because that's really top heavy. But yet those things are very beautiful as well. And so the beauty had little application for landscape painters for the most part, although a garden designer could still devise a plan with rounded shapes and gradual curves. It was beautiful. And remember, Jefferson used the word beautiful, so beautiful in art. So Jefferson is saying that Natural Bridge, I'll talk a lot about the sublimity of it, but it also had a quality of beauty to it. A calm landscape can have beauty. And let me get into the sublime and give you some more examples of what Edmund Burke is saying. And of course, a hurricane is incredibly sublime, and it's he says that it brings a different type of pleasure than does the beautiful, and it's a type of pleasure that results from knowing of perils that pose no immediate threat to the viewer. In other words, the person who took this photograph was intrigued by the power of the hurricane, and we certainly know today we have no control whatsoever of hurricanes. They come through and destroy incredible amounts of property, and there's nothing we can do about it. As human beings, we're helpless. We can't control it. Here's what Burke says. He says that the passions which belong to self-preservation turn on pain and danger. And he says they're delightful when we have an idea of pain and danger without being actually in such circumstances. So the person taking this photograph isn't in danger, so he can enjoy it. And the next one, I got a photograph at random of a volcano. That's certainly sublime. We have absolutely no control over that. But this was taken by someone in a helicopter or plane, so he or she wasn't in any danger. And Burke says they're delightful when we have an idea of pain and danger without being actually in such circumstances. Whatever excites this delight, I call sublime. End quote. And he says the passions belonging to self-preservation are the strongest of all the passions. And then he mentions other things, the quality, situations and qualities that bring about, that can be defined with the word sublime: terror, obscurity, vastness. We've got a slide of an image of the next one is an image of, I believe, the Rocky Mountains. If we can look at the next image. Well, I'll read some while we're trying to get that. He talks about obscurity, power, vastness, magnitude, light, darkness, total light, total darkness, sound, suddenness, or the cries of animals. He talks about, for example, grizzly bears. When I when I look at the grizzly bear, I'm reminded of the journals of Lewis and Clark and how these grizzly bears terrorize them. There's the sound of a grizzly bear because you could shoot them and they could track you for they could follow you for a mile before they drop down dead. So that's sublime. And Burke says all of these are associated with the idea of the sublime. And this idea could help the traveler or the artist come to grips intellectually with powerful forces, like a storm at sea, like an avalanche. I think I have an image of one of those coming up, or total stillness, or total darkness, or death in the passage of time. There's an avalanche. We have no control over something like this. But all of these examples that I'm giving you, what all of them have in common is that these are incomprehensible powers of nature that make us aware of our own human limitations. And Burke calls that sublime. I think I have another image of darkness. The great English cultural historian Kenneth Clark described this. There you see the image of death. That's certainly sublime. We have no control over that, and that brings up the idea of the passage of time. We don't have control over that too. Kenneth Clark talks about what all these things have in common. He uses the phrase "the futility of human arrangements." We can't control any of that. And so the natural bridge could be viewed as something like that, because this is a creation that's almost beyond our comprehension. At least initially, no one had any idea how it was created. It certainly was created by forces of nature beyond our control. It was what people eventually figured out, that it was carved out like the Luray Caverns with gentle erosion that took place over millions of years, and then at some point most of it just collapsed, and leaving the natural bridge there. So at any rate, Burke's philosophies about the landscape guided connoisseurs and artists in Europe and in America for more than a century, and it was followed by innumerable visitors to Natural Bridge. And I'm going to mention a half dozen of these visitors and read you the words they use, because they all use the word sublime or sublimity, and to describe the bridge and their emotional reactions to it. So in Jefferson's book, his Notes on the State of Virginia, which is published in 1785, when a French ambassador requested him for information about the state of Virginia, and he responded with this book, Notes on the State of Virginia, and it's there when he talks about Natural Bridge, and he described it there. And I will read you some more of that. But he said, Natural Bridge is the most sublime of nature's works, end quote. And he used terminology that would be understandable to the readers of Edmund Burke, his book on the philosophical inquiry. And he's clearly borrowing from that source. And if we look at the next image, he said that Jefferson talked about, you can go up to the top of Natural Bridge. There's a road there. There always has been a road there, at least since Jefferson's era. It's still a road there, and you're looking down from the top of it. But he says, few men have resolution to look over into the abyss. Here's a little painting that's in the show next door by Joshua Jarre, about 1820. I'm reading from Jefferson's words. Few men have the resolution to look over into the abyss. You involuntarily fall on your hands and knees, creep to the parapet, peep over it. Looking down from this height about a minute gave me a violent headache. The view from the top is painful and intolerable. So Joshua Jarre, that's probably Joshua Jarre's son who traveled around with him around Virginia. And he obviously had read Jefferson's account, so he's given us this image. I searched for a photograph of it, and I think I couldn't find one. I think we could amend Jefferson's comment to say few photographers have the resolution to look over into the abyss. And then Jefferson says, but from below the view is delightful and an equal extreme. and I'm reading from Jefferson again, it is impossible for the emotions arising from the sublime to be felt beyond what they are here. So beautiful and arch, so elevated, so light and springing, as it were up to heaven, the rapture of the spectator is really indescribable. So if we can go to the next image, I'll show you what he's talking. This is one of the most famous images of Natural Bridge. It's a painting by Frederick Church done in 1852 that's at the University of Virginia Art Museum. And it's you see at the bottom as a figure gesturing up, and he's talking to a visitor. Jefferson engaged a former slave who named himself Patrick Henry to be a caretaker for his property, Natural Bridge. And so Patrick Henry, this man, would greet visitors, and he's gesturing up. He may be pointing up to there's some railings up there to protect the people using the road from falling off the bridge, or he may be just pointing to the sublimity of the bridge, to the height. We know that Frederick Church he surely was interested in Natural Bridge because of the fame that Jefferson gave it, talking about the sublime. The Church was also interested in geology. This is the artist who traveled all over South America, visiting places like Cotopaxi, the mountain Cotopaxi, the volcanoes, to study geology. So he's looking also at geology here. But there are a number of people who came to the site who were lured to it by Jefferson's account, and who wrote about it and sketched it, and they mimicked Jefferson's ideas about sublimity. And I'm going to give you some example of those. And let me go back for a minute and look. If we look at the next image, in some of the earlier artists and writers before Church in 1852, so looked at it in a different way. They exaggerated it more than Jefferson did. So in 1808, a now obscure English painter named William Roberts created a remarkable image of the bridge that exaggerated its sublimity in a way that conforms to Jefferson's account. And he gave the painting to the president, and he said that Jefferson approved my idea to have it engraved. And since the painting is now lost, fortunately it was engraved, and it was engraved a number of times. And so there is the image of it exaggerated greatly. And I have the next image proves the point that it was engraved a number of times. Jefferson hung the painting, the actual canvas, in his dining room at Monticello, and he had also a painting by this William Roberts of Niagara Falls. And we don't know much at all about Roberts. He referred to himself as a Virginian. He met Jefferson at least twice. They were introduced in Europe by a naturalist. We know that in 1786, and it's possible that Jefferson just suggested that he come to Natural Bridge and paint it, and also paint Niagara Falls. And if we go to the next image, I want to show you this remarkable wallpaper panel that we have in our collection that takes Natural Bridge, as you see in the background, from that incredibly exaggerated depiction that William Roberts created. And this is it's a huge wallpaper panel. It's made by the Zubr company in 1833. The company is still in existence in northern France. If you go to their website, it's fascinating. They still have all the wood blocks they used to create this wallpaper. You can buy it today. And the colors are so vibrant because they had a different block for each of the colors. And so the craftsman would ink a block with a certain color and print it on the paper, and then they'd lay out the paper to dry. And when it's dry, then they'd add another colors. And so that's why it's such a good wallpaper. And if we look at the next image, that's why it was chosen by Jackie Kennedy to be in the White House in the diplomatic reception rooms. And our panel that we're talking about is the one on the far right. So you can see it. You can see it there. And the Zubr did a number of other images in early America, most of those in the north around the Hudson River. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk to you a little bit about, here we are, the image again. This is one of the people who made a print. And this is a French scientist and artist named Jacques Jarre. And he's fascinating. He gave an account of his travels. He wrote about the bridge in the manner that Jefferson did, and I will read you that in a minute. But I want to tell you the story that he traveled to the United States in 1815. He stayed here for 8 years. He based himself in New York. He did some teaching. He traveled extensively along the East Coast. And he sent back shipments to the Natural History Museum in Paris and to the King, Louis XVIII. He sent back 48 shipments that included 8,000 specimens, natural history specimens, minerals, trees, and he even sent a moose back to the King, to Paris. And here's what he said about natural bred. To appreciate, I'm reading, these are his words. To appreciate its true grandeur, one must contemplate its gigantic proportions and savage majesty. The crown of superb trees on the summit, the curious accidents of the fracture, the green curtain stretching at the base. The traveler is suddenly terrified to find himself on the edge of an apparently bottomless abyss. So he's talking about that view from the top that Jefferson said. And then he added another thought. He said the bridge will someday fall. And so he didn't know but so much about it. He didn't know exactly how it was formed. But he says it's impossible to describe it, to put it in words. So he had to make this drawing. I'll show you another artist that did it and exaggerated. If we can look at the next slide. This is a Lexington photographer, Michael Miley. He's famous as a photographer of Robert E. Lee because he was a Confederate veteran. He came to Lexington when Lee went there, and he did a number of portraits, photographic portraits of Lee. But he was only a few miles up the road from Natural Bridge, so inevitably he went down there and photographed. He photographed it a lot of times, and this particular image is interesting because he exaggerated in the same sort of way that Bear did, and the way that Jefferson wrote about it. He uses light and shade. He's able to suggest in this image that the bridge tilts. He worked these are glass plates that he produced, and then they're printed from the glass plates. And he worked the glass plates to make it look like the rock sides of the bridge have been shaved away with the passage of time. I mean, whether they were, but he's able to convey that by altering the image like that in the way that you see here. Now, the next image to show you is a distinguished author, James Kirk Paulding, and I'm going to read you his account of Natural Bridge. He wrote numerous long poems, he wrote serious histories, he wrote novels. He was Secretary of the Navy in 1838. He is from New York State. He was a friend of Washington Irving. And in 1816, he offered an account of Natural Bridge. And he says he clearly understood Edmund Burke's emphasis on emotions instead of the objects that kindled them. He said, "My knees shook under me when looking down." And he said, "From below, I was struck with a feeling of sublimity, which no object I've ever seen had hitherto inspired." He said, and then he said, in case we didn't understand, we cannot measure the extent of our feelings of the sublime by calculating the dimensions of any object. It's the effect, not the cause, that furnishes the criterion of sublimity. And he added, "All the views of Natural Bridge that I have seen are utterly deficient in conveying a tolerable idea of the general aspect and expression of this admirable scene, which seems calculated to mortify the pride of man, by proving that neither his imagination or his art is capable of conveying even a remote idea of its majestic beauty." So he brings it all in there, all of Burke, all the idea about the sublime, and he brings in also the beautiful. And what he's doing, he's acknowledging the presence of natural forces that man can neither control or understand or replicate. I'll give you another account. Most of the people who visited the view in the early 19th century reacted to its sublimity. So if we look at the next image, it shows at least what this writer look like. His name is Archibald Alexander. He visits in 1842, and he writes, although I have conversed with many thousands who had seen the natural bridge, and although the liveliness of this emotion is very different in different persons, yet I never saw one of any class who did not view the object with considerable emotion. He described his own response as sudden and entirely new to him. It was, quote, the animal sensation which accompanied the genuine emotion of the sublime. This man, I'm going to have to delve into his history a little bit more, because he was president of Hampton-Sydney College from 1797 until 1806, when a revolt among the students forced him to leave. I have no idea what that was about. But then he went to the Princeton Theological Seminary and taught there for 39 years. That's not Princeton University. The Princeton Theological Seminary is still in existence. It's a Presbyterian seminary. Well, if we look at, I've got some more paintings to show you from a little bit later, about 1860. So this is by David Johnson, and it's like, almost is a decade later than Frederick Church, and it gives us an image of a sensation experienced at Natural Bridge that was not noted by either Paulding or Alexander, but it was recorded by others, and it's a sensation of peace and calm. Jefferson talked about this too. Jefferson said that the distant views at Natural Bridge are, quote, delightful in an equal extreme. We have an account by a traveler self-identified only as E.L.B., writing later in the century, 1886. It is one of those spots on earth that seem made for rest. And Edward Pollard in 1870 said that Niagara Falls represents the sublime as allied to the terrific because of its sound and fury, but Natural Bridge, quote, associates the sublime with the pleasing and the curious. So they're tying the sublime to beauty, just like Jefferson did. And as we get in the middle of the century, the definition of the sublime is getting stretched and changed a little bit. And in 1851, another traveler, Mary Jane Boggs, wrote that initially she, quote, did not think the bridge could be so sublime, but she changed her mind when she was there to believe that, quote, no one could view that splendid arch without a feeling of awe and a thought of the wisdom of its creator. So if we look at the next image, it's another view by David Johnson. He also went up close to it, and he gave us a view akin to Frederick Church's, but he tends to make it a little bit stronger, and he exaggerates it a little bit more. So we can read this in a number of ways, and maybe that's what he wanted us to do, give us it the way we have options as to how we look at this image. He's certainly interested in the geology, just like Frederick Church was, but perhaps there's a message also about its sublimity, and also about the divinity, the fact that God created this incredible wonder. So the Natural Bridge is being depicted everywhere, and mid-century it appears even in one of the great works of American literature, in the novel Moby Dick, and it appears as a metaphor. This is 1851, and describing the great white whale, Herman Melville wrote this: "But soon the forepart of him slowly rose from the water. For an instant, his whole marbleized body formed a high arch, like Virginia's Natural Bridge, and warningly waving his bannered flukes in the air, the grand god revealed himself, sounded, and went out of sight." End quote. So that proves the fame of Natural Bridge at that time in 1850. And I looked to find a photograph of a whale really looking like Natural Bridge, and I could not. This is as close as I could come to it. So I think I'm going to conclude that Herman Melville exaggerated a little bit. And if we look at the next image, we can see that Courier Knobs did too, because Courier Knobs was producing these prints that were extremely popular. And it didn't really matter. The Natural Bridge didn't look much like what you're shown there. It's not nearly so wide, and it looks almost squat because it's so wide. but it was if the scene was chosen by Courier Knobs for a lithograph, that means it was a really popular scene. It was an icon of America and of American culture. Well, for at least a few years after the Civil War, things had been changed by the war, and visitation to Natural Bridge by non-Virginians plummeted. And the writer of a volume called The Virginia Tourist, 1870, wrote, there was a time when the Natural Bridge was esteemed among the greatest wonders of the continent. Of late it has languished in obscurity and neglect, visited only by stray travelers from who are visiting the Virginia Springs. But in that same decade of the 1870s, if we look at the next image, we can see that it did appear in a couple of volumes that were very important. In Picturesque America, it appeared, and there you see it's depicted at the top. It's still famous, it's still revered. And the next image is from Edward King's travel memoir called The Great South, a record of journeys, 1875. I didn't show you the plate that shows the bridge, but I showed you this plate. It's the Roanoke Valley. It shows a train in the distance because I wanted to use that to make the point that it was easy to get to Natural Bridge now by the 1870s. So that helped produce a brief upsurge of tourism and of artistic activity. If we go to the next image, our painting in our collection, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture by Flavius Fisher in 1882, and you see there are a whole bunch of people down there in the bottom, and they look very comfortable in their attire. It's easy for them to get there now because of the train. And Fisher doesn't he doesn't exaggerate. He gives us a pretty good image of what it really looks like. And he certainly conveys its height. He gives us its geological qualities. He gives us a sense that it really is something spectacular. And at this point, people understood how it came about. It was created by slow erosion, and then parts on either side of the bridge collapsed. And so that's an interesting image because at this point, Natural Bridge was losing its fame and allure. And the reason is obvious, because the American West was discovered, and particularly the Grand Canyon and the Yellowstone National Park. And Thomas Moran was producing paintings like this that brought back, and there were photographers doing the same thing, and it brought back this image to the Americans in the East, and it gave a new dimension. These images gave a new dimension to the term wonder of nature, and by this standard, Natural Bridge did not seem to measure up. And after 1900, it descended permanently into a secondary role among the works of nature. And so that's the where it is today. If we look at the next image, my last image I have is to make the point that it certainly didn't die. It sounded, to use Melville's word, it sounded so loudly in the 19th century that it never did fall out of sight, because there was a stereo card industry, and this is one of the stereo card, and there was a postcard industry that were just beginning, and they carried the fame of Natural Bridge throughout the 20th century. And in 2016, just recently, Natural Bridge was included within the Virginia network of state parks, and they said it was due to its historical importance. So that's what I've been talking to you about today. It's historical importance. And so that elevated its status, and it assured its preservation, and it assured that its fame will continue. Now, I mentioned at the start, I'll mention it again, that there's a special exhibition at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts called Virginia Arcadia, the Natural Bridge in American Art. It's on view through August the 1st, and we encourage our members to go and visit, because there's some more than 70 depictions of Virginia's most famous landmark, and 10 works from our collection are included in that show. And it looks at paintings and prints and decorative objects and photography. And it has the most important paintings. I showed you a couple of them, the works by Frederick Church, David Johnson, And one thing that it does, it convinces you that there really was international renown for Natural Bridge. It was known throughout not only America, but throughout the Western world. And I should point out that also we did a large show in 2000 on the Virginia landscape. And that book that we published then is available in our shop. And it has a large section on Natural Bridge, and it includes accounts by an additional 25 visitors to the bridge. You can read their comments, and images by some 15 additional artists that I didn't show you. And we have in our collection more than 100 paintings, aquatints, engravings, lithographs, drawings, photographs, and plus an additional 100 stereo cards and postcard images. And you can go on our webpage and look at our digital records through our digital record system, and you can see many of the 200 works in our collection are illustrated on our webpage. So I invite you to look at that. And at this point, we are certainly open to any questions or comments that any of you would like to make.
Hey there, Bill. That was fantastic. I love learning about Natural Bridge, and I really want to go visit now. So we do have one question so far, and as a reminder, if anybody would like to submit questions, just go ahead and send those in as a comment. But Bill, to get us started, out of all of the artworks and writings that you shared with us today, which one feels the most sublime to you?
That's a good question. It's sort of the point. If I were living 200 years ago, I would, I could answer that easily. They don't seem that sublime, but I suspect the one from the top looking down. And I confess, I've been to Natural Bridge a couple of times. I've never gone up to the top and looked down. I think that would be very sublime to me. And again, I'm going back to the idea of these forces of nature. Yeah, thank you, Haley. These forces of nature that we have no control over, and that we realize the futility of human arrangements, as Kenneth Clark put it. It's this sort of thing is beyond our comprehension, and I think the strongest images are both in the show: the Frederick Church painting that the University of Virginia owns, and the David Johnson painting that's at the it's in Winston-Salem, are the strongest images. And I think they're powerful enough as works of art so that you can look at them long enough and not get tired of looking at them. And I think if you look at them long enough, you start thinking about it, and then you do realize that it really is sublime. This creation really is something that shows how little we as humans are, and how these forces of nature are beyond our control.
Yeah, it certainly does, especially from the imagery, seems sort of awe-inspiring. And I was surprised to learn, I know personally, I have never been to Natural Bridge, and so learning about just how exaggerated the imagery is, but the fact that people who witnessed it still walked away feeling like it was sublime and feeling like it was this incredible work of nature is impressive. So the artist didn't even have to exaggerate.
No, I think it's really surprising to read all of these accounts and to see how they really exaggerate it. And then you realize that the Jefferson's behind all of this.
Yeah.
And he was incredibly effective. And his purpose was to get people to come to Virginia and to appreciate Virginia. And he knew exactly what bells to ring. And the right bell was to bring up Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origins of the sublime and the beautiful. It certainly worked.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Even today, when I've just done like brief Google searches on Natural Bridge, you can see that that's where people go to have portraits taken in their wedding dress.
That's
and it's still certainly a landmark that draws a lot of people to Virginia and to it, which is impressive. And that Jefferson had some of the foresight to make that part of Virginia's story.
You're certainly right about the weddings. When I was looking through, of course, you go on the internet, you find innumerable photographs, but I really was surprised to see several of weddings taking place down there. I hadn't even thought of that, but that and it's almost, it does have a religious quality, I suppose. I suppose they're picking up on that theme. It's like a great church.
Yeah. Absolutely. I can totally see that. So, Bill, it doesn't look like we've got any other questions coming in, but folks are always welcome to submit them, and we can get back to people at a later date since the recording will be available. But thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed and appreciated it.
Oh, good. Thank you. And I encourage our listeners to, if you haven't seen the show at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, it's a rare opportunity to see those images that have never been brought together before.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we hope to see you at another virtual program soon. Thanks so much.